For nearly 5 decades, Graceland stood frozen in time, honoring Elvis Presley, the king of rock and roll.
When Florida wildlife officials stood in front of the cameras and said they were sending thousands of trained snake-killing creatures into the Everglades, most people assumed it was a joke. Late-night hosts poked fun at it. Comment sections filled up with jokes about Florida man finally going too far. Even some biologists rolled their eyes, certain this was just another headline-grabbing stunt in a state already famous for alligators wandering into swimming pools and iguanas falling out of trees during cold snaps. But this wasn't a stunt, and it wasn't a joke. It was a last resort. For nearly 3 decades, one of the most successful invasive predators on the planet had been quietly swallowing the Everglades from the inside out, and nothing humans had tried was working fast enough to stop it. The creatures Florida was about to unleash weren't going to be paraded in front of news cameras or given cute nicknames. Most people would never even see them, and that was exactly the point. What followed wasn't a Hollywood ending. It was stranger, slower, and in some ways far more unsettling than anyone expected. Because to understand why Florida got desperate enough to fight snakes with snakes, you first have to understand just how badly the Everglades had already lost. The story starts decades before anyone in Florida was worried about it. Beginning in the 1970s, the exotic pet trade brought enormous numbers of Burmese pythons into the United States, prized by collectors for their size and striking patterns. Over the following decades, well over 180,000 of these snakes were legally imported into the country, many of them ending up in South Florida living rooms and backyard enclosures. Burmese pythons look impressive in a glass tank when they are 2 feet long. They look considerably less manageable once they've grown past 10 feet and require a small mountain of food every week. Some owners, overwhelmed and unable to find anywhere that would take a giant constrictor off their hands, made a decision that would quietly reshape an entire ecosystem. They let them go. Others escaped during storms, including the chaos of Hurricane Andrew in 1992, when a breeding facility was destroyed and an unknown number of snakes vanished into the wetlands. South Florida turned out to be close to perfect for them. The climate mirrored the humid wetlands of Southeast Asia the species originally came from. The Everglades offered endless cover, warm water, and an all-you-can-eat buffet of native mammals and birds that had never evolved any defense against a predator like this. By the 1980s, breeding populations were already established. Nobody was paying much attention yet. That would change. By the time wildlife agencies fully grasped what was happening, the numbers were already staggering. Burmese pythons are ambush predators with an almost unbelievable appetite, capable of swallowing prey as large as full-grown deer and even alligators. In a landscape with no natural checks on their population, they multiplied largely unchecked. The damage showed up first in the data, and then it showed up in the eerie silence of parts of the Everglades that used to be full of life. Long-term surveys comparing wildlife sightings before and after the python invasion found that raccoon populations in the hardest-hit areas of Everglades National Park had collapsed by more than 99%. Opossums weren't far behind, with sightings dropping by nearly 99% as well. Bobcats declined by roughly 87%. Marsh rabbits and foxes became so scarce in some areas that researchers stopped recording them entirely. This wasn't just a story about a few unlucky species. Every animal a python eats is also an animal that native predators like panthers, hawks, and bobcats depend on. Wildlife officials describe it as a kind of slow-motion collapse, where pulling one thread, the prey base, eventually unravels the entire food web above it. And because Burmese pythons are almost invisible in the wild, blending perfectly into leaf litter and shallow water, biologists estimate that even trained researchers spot less than 1% of the pythons actually living in an area during a search. For every snake removed by hand, an unknown but enormous number remain hidden. That single statistic is what turned python control from a wildlife nuisance into something closer to a crisis. You cannot fight an enemy you can't see. And that's exactly the problem Florida had to solve before it could even think about reducing the population. The idea that finally started to work sounds almost like a riddle. To catch the snakes nobody could find, researchers decided to use the snakes themselves. Certain male Burmese pythons were captured, fitted with small radio or satellite transmitters, and released back into the wild. These scout snakes weren't there to be killed. They were there to do what male pythons do naturally during breeding season, which is roam huge distances searching for females. Biologists then simply tracked the signal. When a scout snake eventually located a breeding female, often one that had gathered dozens of other snakes around her, researchers would follow the transmitter straight to the group and remove them all at once. It was elegant, a little unsettling, and it worked far better than random searching ever had. A single scout snake, used correctly over a season, could lead trackers to far more pythons than a team of hunters walking the same ground blind. This program became one of the quiet backbones of Florida's python strategy, precisely because it turned the snake's own biology into a weapon against its own population. Alongside the scout snake program, wildlife agencies began training detector dogs specifically to sniff out python scent, another set of creatures recruited into the fight that most tourists driving past the Everglades would never notice at all. These dogs could cover ground far faster than a human searcher and pick up on scent trails invisible to the naked eye, leading handlers to snakes tucked deep in brush that would otherwise have gone completely undetected. None of this looked like the science fiction image people had in their heads when they first heard thousands of snake-killing creatures. There was no swarm of genetically engineered predators crawling out of trucks. It was something quieter and, in its own way, more clever, turning the python's greatest advantages, its stealth and its own reproductive drive, into the very tools used to hunt it down. The scout snakes and detector dogs were only part of the picture. Florida also needed boots on the ground, and lots of them. This is where the thousands in the story actually comes from, not a single dramatic release, but a slow, steady mobilization of an army of human hunters incentivized to do what no automated system could: search relentlessly, day after day, across hundreds of miles of swamp. The state's python elimination program pays contracted hunters an hourly rate to patrol public lands searching for pythons, with bonus payments for every snake they remove and even larger bonuses for finding an active nest of eggs, since destroying a nest prevents dozens of future snakes from ever hatching. Layered on top of that is the now famous Florida Python Challenge, an annual public hunt that draws competitors from across the country, all chasing cash prizes for catching the most snakes or the single longest one. In 2025 alone, nearly 1,000 participants took part in the Python Challenge, working 10 straight days across the Everglades. It's the kind of event that generates plenty of headlines and social media clips of enormous, writhing pythons held aloft by triumphant hunters. But even organizers are honest about its limits. Public hunts like this raise awareness and remove a meaningful number of snakes, but they barely dent a population believed to number anywhere from the tens of thousands to several 100,000 animals spread across the region. As one researcher involved in the effort put it, eradication simply isn't realistic anymore. The honest goal is long-term management, not victory. Since organized removal efforts began, tens of thousands of pythons have been reported to wildlife officials and physically removed from the landscape, the vast majority found by contracted hunters using nothing more sophisticated than trained eyes, patience, and a willingness to wade into snake-infested water at night, since pythons are most active after dark. It's grueling, unglamorous work, and it's the real engine behind Florida's fight, even if it doesn't look nearly as cinematic as the headline made it sound. There was also a stranger experiment buried in the research that helped explain just how much damage these snakes were doing. Scientists released dozens of marsh rabbits, each fitted with a tracking collar, into python territory specifically to study what would happen to them. Within less than a year, the vast majority of those rabbits were killed, and pythons were responsible for the overwhelming majority of those deaths. It was a grim but clarifying experiment, proving in real time exactly how efficiently these snakes were emptying the landscape of the prey native predators needed to survive. For the hunters themselves, the work is nothing like the adrenaline-fueled competition the headlines suggest. Most searching happens at night, often on foot along narrow levee roads or wading through canals, using headlamps to catch the telltale reflection of python eyes in the dark. A single shift might run 10 hours and produce nothing at all. Hunters describe long stretches of silence broken by the sudden, heart-pounding moment of spotting a shape in the grass that turns out to be exactly what they were looking for. It's slow, physically demanding, mosquito-bitten work, carried out largely without recognition, by people who keep going back out because they know that even one snake removed is one less breeding female laying dozens of eggs the following spring. Just when it seemed like the fight against pythons was purely a numbers game, biologists uncovered something that turned the invasion into an even deeper problem than anyone had realized. Burmese pythons, it turned out, were carrying a non-native lung parasite, one that had never existed in Florida's ecosystem before they arrived. That parasite doesn't stay confined to pythons. It spreads through a life cycle involving insects and amphibians as intermediate hosts, eventually working its way into native snake species like banded water snakes and black races. Infected native snakes can develop lesions and nodules, and in severe cases, worms have been found emerging directly from the animals' bodies. Researchers tracking the disease describe it as a genuinely difficult problem to treat in wild populations, since there's currently no practical way to medicate snakes living freely across hundreds of square miles of wetland. For now, the only real defense is monitoring, reporting sightings of visibly infected snakes, and hoping the parasite doesn't spread as fast as the pythons that introduced it in the first place. It was a sobering reminder that an invasive species rarely does just one kind of damage. Burmese pythons weren't just eating their way through the Everglades' mammal and bird populations. They were quietly exporting a disease into native reptiles that had never needed an immune defense against it, adding another slow-burning threat layered on top of the one everybody could already see. If there's one moment that captures just how far things had gotten before Florida finally got serious, it's the images that started circulating of pythons that had swallowed alligators. Not baby alligators, either. Full-grown, several-foot-long alligators, consumed whole by snakes that biologists had, until that point, still thought of as impressive but manageable predators. The photographs of a python found split open with an alligator's tail visibly protruding from its body traveled around the world. And for a lot of people outside Florida, that was the first time they understood this wasn't a story about oversized pets escaping into a swamp. It was a story about an apex predator establishing itself at the very top of an ecosystem that had never had to defend against anything like it. Alligators had spent millions of years as the undisputed top predator of the Everglades. Suddenly, they weren't anymore, at least not everywhere. That single image did more to change public opinion than any wildlife agency press release. Skeptics who had assumed the python problem was overstated started paying attention. Lawmakers who had been slow to fund removal programs found it much easier to justify the expense once their constituents had seen, in graphic detail, exactly what these snakes were capable of. In a strange way, one photograph of an alligator inside a python did more for python control funding than a decade of scientific papers. As the human hunters, scout snakes, and detector dogs worked the ground, researchers kept looking for ways to find pythons without needing to physically stumble across one hiding in the brush. One of the more promising tools to emerge involved environmental DNA, sometimes shortened to EDNA. Every animal that moves through water sheds tiny traces of genetic material as it goes: skin cells, waste, mucus, all invisible to the eye but detectable in a water sample under the right lab conditions. By collecting water samples from canals and marshes and screening them for python DNA, scientists could confirm whether snakes were present in an area, even in places where nobody had ever actually spotted one. It didn't tell researchers exactly where a python was hiding, but it told them where to concentrate their limited hunters and dogs, turning blind searches into targeted ones. Some teams also began experimenting with strategically placed camera traps and even robotic decoys designed to mimic the size and movement of prey animals, hoping to lure pythons into view long enough to be spotted and removed. None of these tools worked alone. That turned out to be one of the most important lessons of the entire program. A scout snake might lead researchers to a breeding aggregation once a year. A detector dog might find snakes tucked into brush that EDNA sampling flagged as a hot spot. A contracted hunter working overnight shifts might catch the snakes that avoided all of the above. Florida's real strategy wasn't one clever trick. It was dozens of imperfect tools stacked on top of each other, each one covering for the blind spots of the others. Not everyone was on board with every part of the plan, and the program has never been without controversy. Some critics argued that public hunts like the Python Challenge, however good they were for publicity, risked encouraging inexperienced participants to wander into dangerous wetland terrain at night chasing a cash prize, occasionally requiring rescues of hunters who got lost or injured in the process. Others raised concerns about whether large-scale removal efforts were disturbing other, unrelated wildlife in the process, since searching remote habitat at night inevitably means disturbing more than just the target species. There were also ethical questions raised about the use of scout snakes themselves. The technique depends on keeping a population of tagged, breeding-capable pythons alive and free in the wild specifically so they can locate mates, which some found uncomfortable given that the entire goal of the program is eliminating the species. Researchers defended the trade-off by pointing to the math. A small number of permanently tracked snakes leading hunters to dozens of otherwise invisible pythons a year represented a clear net reduction in the population, even if it meant a handful of traitor snakes stayed alive and breeding in the meantime. None of these debates slowed the program down much. If anything, they pushed researchers to refine their methods further, tightening welfare protocols for tracked snakes and adding more safety training for public hunt participants. The controversy, in the end, became part of what kept the program in the public eye, which arguably helped keep funding and volunteer interest alive year after year. So did Florida's strange, scattered army of scout snakes, detected dogs, contracted hunters, and weekend competitors actually win? Not in the way the more sensational headlines wanted people to believe. There was no single dramatic turning point where the python population collapsed overnight, no viral footage of the Everglades suddenly returning to how it looked in the 1980s. Anyone hoping for a clean victory lap left disappointed. What did happen was more incremental, and in its own way, more impressive. Removal numbers climbed steadily year over year. The scout snake technique proved so effective that it became one of the most closely watched tools in invasive species management anywhere in the country, and researchers elsewhere have studied whether the same approach could work against other invasive predators. Detection technology kept improving, with newer tools like thermal imaging and even trained sniffer dogs boosting the odds of finding snakes that would once have gone completely unnoticed. Public awareness, fueled by the Python Challenge and no small amount of viral social media attention, meant more ordinary Floridians reporting sightings, which gave wildlife officials more data than they'd ever had before. But the scientists closest to the problem remain clear-eyed about what winning actually looks like now. Nobody involved in the program believes Burmese pythons can be fully eradicated from South Florida at this point. The population is too large, too well-established, and too good at hiding for that to be realistic. Instead, the goal has shifted to something less flashy but far more sustainable: containment. Keeping the python range from expanding further north, protecting the most vulnerable native species where they can, and slowly, patiently grinding down the numbers year after year using every tool available, from a single radio-collared scout snake slithering through the swamp at night to 1,000 weekend hunters competing for a cash prize. It's not the ending anyone expected when they first heard that Florida was releasing thousands of snake-killing creatures into the wild. There was no army of monsters,